Welcome back to the Restricted Handling Podcast. We're going to talk Israel, Gaza, Russia, China today. And as always, you've got myself, Ryan Fugit, former Army aviator and CIA officer. And for a much longer time at the CIA, we've got Glenn Corn, multi-time chief of station, 34 years in the U.S. government, mainly in the CIA, but also at the State Department and the Army as well. Covered a whole host of topics, including a lot of those we're going to dig into today. Glenn, how you doing and where are you calling in from?
Hey, Ryan. Nice to see you. I am calling in from Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia.
It's where all the action usually happens, except for during the shutdown.
I'm sure there's still a lot of action going on. As a matter of fact, many of our friends and former colleagues are working through the shutdown. They're doing their best. Some have taken on additional duties, so God bless them. Others are. I ran into somebody last night who's not working because they told they want to get back to work because they feel, people in our profession or where we came from, they just feel very mission oriented. So,
And we're going to talk Israel first. And the action there in the U.S. has been, I think, down in Florida, where some deals were being made with Kushner, Witkoff, and others, as have been reported. But I think it's important, as we are recording on Friday, October 10th, a ceasefire has been arranged. A few things have happened very specifically today. So just to go through those before we dig in, Israel has agreed to this ceasefire. They have agreed to move their troops to pre-position lines still within Gaza, but back from some of the cities. They are allowing Gazans back in. So they move their troops. Once Israel moves their troops, Hamas has 72 hours to release Israeli prisoners. Israel, in turn, is going to release 250 Palestinian prisoners and then 1,722 Gazans who have been detained since the war started. We know Trump might be in Israel coming up on Monday, which could be a very important point. And then on top of that, the U.S. is helping observe some of these positioning changes of the Israeli military. One of the key sticking points, however, is that Israel and Hamas still do not agree on Hamas disarming or Gaza writ large disarming, which will be a huge component of this going forward. But at least a lot of the fighting stopped and people are coming back home.
yes.
Glenn, what else did we miss there? And then how are you interpreting this? We talked last week about this deal as it was getting solidified. Now it's in action.
Right. Well, I mean, I would say congratulations to the parties and to the administration for getting to this phase one, which looks like it's moving forward, the first part of a potential longer term deal. I'm sure there's more work, a lot more work to be done. As you mentioned, Ryan, the parties haven't agreed on a very key issue, and that's the disarmament of Hamas. We've said before they have the same issue in Lebanon right now, like the debate over disarming Lebanese Hezbollah, two threats to Israel's national security. Positive momentum, and I think personally, I think it's great. One of the things is now they're going to start seeing food deliveries, medical deliveries back into Gaza. As you mentioned, the Israelis are going to withdraw from certain portion. I think they're going to remain in control of 58%, something like that, of Gaza. They're going to turn the rest over to a transitional authority, multinational, which is also very interesting to see the players that will be participating. I just read there'll be, I think, 200 U.S. troops deploying to help coordinate. The Turks, the Qataris, maybe the Emiratis, the Saudis will be participating, so some of the Gulf states, and maybe the Egyptians. I'm not really sure on that, but so far good. And I'm sure a lot of people are happy. By Monday, I think the hostages should be returned. Remember earlier, Hamas said they couldn't guarantee that because they didn't know where all of them are. If that is true, that's a problem, but Hamas has lied plenty in the past. So hopefully that means that they knew where they were. They were just using that as a bargaining tactic. And they've decided to stop the carnage that they started in 2023. The fight, there's a ceasefire in place. That's good news. Let's hope it holds. Another thing is very interesting. Today, the president announced that the Iranians have expressed their support
Yes.
to this, and that they will support the peace effort, which is good news, positive sign. Again, we're going to watch that very closely. The administration has had success, I would say multiple successes on the diplomatic front on issues that have been extremely difficult or impossible to solve up until now. And this is all very good. So we have the issue of Azerbaijan, Armenia, which was a long-term problem, didn't get as much attention in the U.S. as obviously the Arab-Israeli conflict, but really, really complicated. There's been very positive news on that front, but let's just hope that we can sustain the positive momentum. And that's going to take a lot of diplomacy and a lot of hard work and a lot of engagement.
One of the things that has been reported in a few outlets. I don't know who broke it, but that the event that really pushed Trump over the edge was the strike in Doha. Sounds like it was uncoordinated, lots of frustration after that, and that was it. You'd had it, and that was a little bit too much spillover, apparently, as it's being reported. And that really supercharged some of these discussions to where we are today, which is
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah. I mean, remember we have U.S. troops there. The president has good relations with the Gulf leaders. I think the Gulf has been a high priority for him. The relationships with the Gulf states, and so I could see why that was. And I think many people interpreted that move as like just the Israelis had gone too far.
Yeah.
I think the president probably has a relationship with Netanyahu that is much different than his predecessor, than the president's predecessor for various reasons. And he's using that and he's using that influence to push, which is good, I think.
Glenn, do you think that if Netanyahu knew that would have been the outcome, that he still would have taken that shot in Doha? If it
No,
would have led to this?
no, this is my assessment. No, I think he maybe
Yeah.
miscalculated.
Just to see if we would react or how the international community would react.
I think, Ryan, when we talk about this, sometimes some of these foreign leaders get into the habit. They see when we don't respond in like a forceful manner. The same thing with Putin for years, right? And that led to what's going on in Ukraine, in my assessment. With Netanyahu, maybe he got into this cycle of believing that he could do what he wanted without any kind of negative response. And my understanding is the president was very upset when they did what they did in Doha, in Qatar. And so the president seems to have used his influence to make it clear that enough is enough. And he also used his relationships with the Gulf states and with the Turks. I tell everybody, I think what he did with President Erdogan was very, very positive, bringing him to the White House, including him on the discussions of solving this issue. And one of the potential positive outcomes of this is the diffusion of tension between Tel Aviv and Ankara, which is very important for us
Yeah.
and the region.
One of the other things with Iran that came up, U.S. just recently sanctioned 90 Iranian individuals and entities, just really putting a lot of pressure on. And some of the comments, as Iran has said that they're open to these peace talks or want to be more involved, they've still said that they want to enrich uranium. Of course, Trump has been very clear they cannot have a nuclear weapon. Sure, that will be another sticking point here. But just the fact that they are making that type of outreach after we struck them not that long ago is mind blowing to most people who have covered Iran, I think, for lots of their lives to imagine we're at a place like this.
Yeah, my own assessment is sometimes you have to show people you have teeth. You have to demonstrate that you're willing to take action, to that there will be consequences when they cross the line. And I
Yeah.
think maybe the Iranians finally got that message after years of being appeased. They intimidated, they threatened, they pushed, and again, there could be progress on the Iran front. I think many of us would love to see that, but I don't think progress is going to come if we take a policy of appeasement with the supreme leader and his cohort.
What's your best guess as to this ceasefire continuing? If I had to put you on the line, you think in 2 weeks we'll still have a ceasefire in place and a decision on disarming Hamas?
I think there'll probably be some violations. There'll be small scale violations. It's going to be tough to keep the the ceasefire in place, but I think it can be sustained at least long enough to continue the dialogue, the negotiations on disarming Hamas.
Yeah.
And I think what's critical here is that we have the Gulf states, like Hamas's main sponsors, financial sponsors, together saying, well, this has got to stop, and willing to give some guarantees to the Palestinian people, right? So for their sake, and they will benefit from this. Hamas may not benefit, but I don't think any of us should want to see Hamas rewarded for its bad behavior, right?
All right, let's pivot to Russia again, like showing teeth. A few interesting things that have happened recently. Number one, the total death count there for the Russians is at 135,100 now, according to BBC Media Zona over as of yesterday. But also there were some leaked documents, so hard to determine the veracity here, but leaked by a Ukrainian group that shows Russian casualty data as the Russians are tracking it, having 280,000 losses. That's wounded and killed over the past 8 months, basically throughout this calendar year, and really just specifically Russia in that one. So Russia trying to hide a lot of that. They are obviously much different numbers than we hear them say publicly, and then what the BBC and Media Zone are tracking still staggering amounts of death, over 135,000. So that's where we're at there. But one of the very interesting things that happened in the past few days that I knew you would be great to get your take on is Putin talking to Azerbaijan and taking responsibility for downing an airliner there last year. What is the story on that, Glenn?
Right. But let me start with this. There's two Russians. They meet on the street. They start talking. One guy says, "Hey, Ivan, do you know that we're at war with NATO?" And Sergei says, "No, I didn't know that." And he says, "Oh no, yeah, we're at war." He said, "Well, how's it going?" He said, "Well, so far we've lost 500 of our main battle tanks, most modern tanks, 25 of our modern aircraft. Our premier flagship, the Moskva, was sunk in the Black Sea. The fleet has been chased out of Sevastopol, the main port, the main base. We've lost hundreds and thousands of soldiers. We have all these casualties." And Ivan says, "Wow, how about NATO?" And Sergei says, "Oh no, NATO hasn't even started fighting yet."
Yeah.
Sorry, joke. But that's
This a joke from, is this like an old
no,
joke?
no. This is a joke that I recently heard from a Russian.
Yeah.
I'll give you another good one. I try and do this, so translate it into English. But basically, a Russian goes into a shoe store in Moscow and he says, "I would like a pair of shoes." And the guy says, "What size are you?" He says, "Size 10, but give me a size 5. And the shoe seller says, the guy in the store says, why would you want a size 5? He says, "No, I like to have my shoes really, really tight and cause me a lot of pain. And I walk around in them all day. And then when I go home and I take them off, it's the only time in my life where I feel good about anything."
As a microcosm of Russian policy, basically.
And what's going on now, shifting to Azerbaijan. If you remember last year, at the end of the year, the Russians shot down an Azeri civilian airliner flying in the North Caucasus. I think there were 38 deaths. The Russians initially claimed that they didn't shoot it down. They made some misstatements, basically disinformation. They accused the pilots of not following direction with the landing, and that's what caused the crash. Again, a lot of disinformation, basically lies. Transcripts were leaked of the tower speaking with the pilots, and it's been demonstrated that that was not true. The Azeris responded very swiftly and were very upset. They made it very clear to Moscow that what happened was unacceptable. They wanted an apology. Putin refused to apologize. There was a lot of back and forth. And in the last couple of months, there has been a spike in tension between Moscow, including the arrest of Azeris inside, I think Azeris inside of Russia, and then counter arrests in Azerbaijan, the detention of the Sputnik editor-in-chief or bureau chief in Baku for promoting disinformation inside of Azerbaijan. Other steps taken by the Azeris, including moving closer to the EU and Ukrainians, providing the Ukrainians with energy resources, which were badly needed. And there were Russian strikes against some of the Azeri terminals or facilities that were delivering oil and gas to Ukraine. But bottom line, it seems now that President Putin has realized that he needs to make amends with Azerbaijan. It's a country with rising influence. You saw the reception that President Aliyev got from President Trump in the Oval Office recently. The Azeri military has, the Azeris have invested a great deal in their armed forces. They've had a lot of help from Turkey, and some say from the Israelis in the last 30 years. And so they've built a formidable military capability regionally. They're feeling their power, and they want to be respected. And so what President Aliyev has done, what the Azeris has done, has been very interesting, and it sent a very clear message to Moscow that they cannot bully and just walk all over the interests of their former republics. So that's one thing. Too, I think that this demonstrates Putin realizes he's got a lot of problems internally, and he is losing allies very quickly, or even semi-allies.
Is that, why now? Of all times, what would drive that? Just the US and Azerbaijan getting a little closer?
I think that's part of it. They definitely don't want to see us too close. They don't want to see the Azeris move too close to Washington. Again, I think that they understand internally they have problems. Let's, look at what the Ukrainians are doing to the Russian gas, the energy infrastructure, gas and oil terminals, pipelines, which are causing big problems for the Russians domestically. And anyone that read the restricted handling update recently knows that now there's infighting going on in let's say Kremlin circles or the inner circle in Moscow, influential circles, about how the Russian won the policy of the war. One of the Putin's senior advisors recently resigned because he had been against the war against Ukraine from the beginning, Kozak. I just read that the central bank has determined or declared that actions taken by the Kremlin against some Russian companies and investors are basically illegal. which is
Yeah.
fascinating to see. So there's beginning to be signs of dissent from inside the central part of Moscow, what we call the Garden Ring, inside the Garden Ring.
Is that what they call it? Like inside the Beltway? Is that
Yeah, like
as
the
we
inner
call
ring.
these?
Yeah, I mean that's like the center part of Moscow, where the Kremlin is, where most of the ministries are.
Let me ask you on the central bank piece. I found that fascinating that it happened in Russia. Of course, just the stomach on somebody in that position to actually go forward and say that publicly. Would that be choreographed with Putin ahead of time? I mean, aren't you risking quite a bit as a policymaker if you're in that central bank?
Yeah, I'm sure you are, but sometimes people do the right thing and they speak up. This is not the only time it's happened, by the way, in the last, 3 years. There have been other Russians who've come out vocally against, policies. If you remember, there was the TV broadcaster, she walked off the air because she couldn't see
Yeah.
what was happening. There was a senior Russian official who was working in one of the research institutes who resigned his job because he wrote an article which was very critical of the war in Ukraine and Russia's propaganda against the United States, especially that was being used to justify kind of aggressive military actions outside of Russia's borders. So, and of course, Mr. Kozak resigning also, and I think that kind of action should be applauded,
Yeah.
because for us to say that here is one thing, but for
Easy.
people to stand up inside of a dictatorship and say something is wrong or say what we would consider the right thing, I think deserves a lot of respect. That takes a lot of courage.
Yeah.
And
We
of
need to
course,
do a better job of highlighting those on this show, the people that are standing up on that.
I agree with you. And so in this case, the head of the central bank, Nabulina, she's a force to be reckoned with.
Speaking of some of the
That does remind me of a question, though, Ryan. What does a Russian oligarch say when he checks into a hotel?
what does he say?
I'd like a room on the first floor, please.
Yes. I think maybe you keyed me on to the term. Is it defenestration? Did you tell me that?
No,
The
no,
term
no.
of thrown out of windows?
I know I have not heard that before. Defenestration?
All right. I'm going to check it while we're on air here. Hold on.
Okay. Maybe some of our viewers, our
Yes.
listeners know.
That is a word. That is the action of throwing someone out of a window.
Hmm.
It's also the action of dismissing someone from a position of power. And I feel
Okay.
like those go hand in hand.
Wow. Administration. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to add that to the
Don't say we
vocabulary.
didn't teach you anything on this show,
Well,
folks.
it's better to be defenestrated from the first floor window than from the ninth floor
Yes.
or the basement.
True. Yeah, probably the worst place would be the basement. Okay. A few things going on. The Institute for the Study of War, which is a great resource for folks if they haven't seen that before. Some of their analysts were talking about what they describe as Russia being at phase 0 in its efforts against NATO. And this is some of their propaganda machine, sabotage, gray area operations. One that came up this week in particular was Russian state media reporting on the SVR, who had accused the Brits of working with the Ukrainians to stage a false flag attack on a Ukrainian vessel somewhere to show basically that Russia is an aggressor against NATO and the West. Very hard to believe this, of course, but very much part of their playbook. And I just think it's interesting calling it phase 0 for this work with NATO. And that's the first time I'd heard this in this context. So that came up. And then the other part is China has been selling some equipment, of course, to Russia, but in this case, some jamming equipment, not just for UAVs, but just avionics in general. And of course, we've reported over the past month or so of aircraft being jammed, at least their comms or some of their avionics flying around NATO airspace. So no surprise there.
There's also some news reporting that actually the Chinese are beginning to limit or cut or stop
Yep.
export to Russia of some of the components and some of the equipment they need to build weapon systems. If it's true, it's very interesting. Anytime you see something like that in the media, you really have to dig into it. And it could be, false information, disinformation, kind of to deceive people. Beijing and Moscow are good at that in the disinformation space. But it's also possible that Beijing realizes that the Russians are going too far in their actions in Europe. They are really pushing the Europeans and NATO. They're basically putting their backs up against the wall by violating airspace, threatening, heads of state with their actions, jamming aircraft, flying over commercial airports, flying drones. We see the French recently stopped and boarded a ship that they claimed was being used to fly drones, which I applaud the French for that. C'est magnifique. Oui, oui. Maybe Beijing realizes this is getting the Russians may be going too far and risking crossing a red line that they don't want to cross, that Beijing doesn't want to cross.
I have a slightly spicy take on why they may have done this. I saw the reporting. There are two things that come to mind with China. There's a massive summit coming up with Trump and Xi the end of this month. So 3 weeks off. Both the US and China are starting to posture heavily with different sanctions or economic packages that they're levying. There's also I think it's November 9th when the tariff agreement ends. And so obviously the Trump Xi summit will address like what happens next trade wise. But I think you've got these different entities starting to layer on hardline positions that they can then pull back from a negotiating standpoint. So I would say maybe that's one.
Mm-hmm.
The second I would say is Russian purchases from China have gone down, I think 9% over the past year. And I don't know if Russia would buy military equipment directly from China in this sense. Like some of the things that China has restricted are in the manufacturing capability, like how to finally manufacture metals that could be used for military weapons and systems. I don't know if they would buy those directly from China, but there is a gap that's happening now. And I wonder if China wants a little more money coming in for what they're building. Two hot takes. We'll see on either of those.
I think very, very good takes. Very possible. The other possibility is the Chinese are realizing that they're investing in the wrong horse. That Russia is not succeeding. That Russia is dragging this out. That President Putin squandered his opportunity to stop this war, and that the Chinese have invested a lot in Russia, and they could lose a lot if Russia collapses and it doesn't turn out the way that Beijing wants. So,
Yeah.
right, which may be related to your hot take that they want to be paid for what they're sending, and Russia can't pay.
How about on the economic front? Speaking of that, merging your two worlds of Russia and Turkey, as we talk about a lot, Turkey is just committed to purchasing, I think, at least half, if not more, of their liquid or their LNG from the US or Algeria, decreasing their reliance on Russian LNG, but still being able to take in Russian LNG at a discount and sell that off elsewhere. It seems like Erdogan struck a perfect deal in the moment that's going to save them money, make them look good to the US, make them look bad to Russia, like showing a strong front there. Any surprise from your time working those areas, Glenn?
No surprise. I mean, one, the Turks have been looking for ways to reduce their energy dependency on Russia for a long time. They're not naive. They understand what the danger of being too reliant on Russia was. They allowed themselves to get in that situation. I would argue we allowed them to get in that situation because we weren't aggressive enough in the 90s and in the early 2000s in responding to some of the requirements that the Turks had. They have a requirement. They have an economy, which, they have manufacturing. They need energy. They have obviously a population that needs heat, energy. So the step that Erdogan took, I do agree with you. I think it's a very smart step because it's showing that he's trying to compromise with President Trump, give Trump a win. And then, on top of all this, we have to, if you look at the daily brief that you sent out this morning, or we sent out this morning, some Europeans have actually increased their purchase of Russian energy in the last year. And so the Turks, I'm sure, are saying, well, if the Europeans are doing it, we're not going to crash our economy alone in NATO. So we have a lot of work to do. And President Trump, I believe, is spot on when he says, look, we're not going to fund two sides of a war. So, but yeah. I think the meeting with President Erdogan in the White House, I was very happy to see that. I think there are a lot of positive benefits that come out of it. You heard President Trump's message to President Erdogan. The one thing that you can really do is stop, trading with Russia, stop supplying Russia with funding they need to continue this war. I think President Erdogan got the message, and he's trying to find a compromise to keep his economy from tanking while also moving away from the reliance or over-reliance on Russian oil and gas.
On to missiles now.
We say in Turkish, aferin.
What is that?
Like, well done.
Well done. Aferin. Okay, a couple things as it comes to missiles, starting with nukes. Moscow has officially withdrawn from another, maybe not nuclear, but the Plutonium Management and Disposition Agreement, one of the last big nuclear arms control deals that was still standing, as another counter to like, don't mess with us. We're going to pull out of this if you all test any weapons. And the rhetoric keeps coming, not from Putin, but from Medvedev and some of the other folks that are the usual mouthpieces here. But on the missile side, because we talked about it before, Trump is still weighing the decision to greenlight Tomahawks to Ukraine, which gives them really deep strike capability and very effective, not just the range, but the effect of it. which we talked about a week ago. But the counter that Russia had suggested was going to Venezuela. They would put Iskander missiles in Venezuela. And I'm not saying it was because we talked about it and you gave this advice, Glenn, but now they're talking about moving them from Venezuela to Cuba. Probably because you were right in your assessment that we would have every reason to go after Venezuela anyway. So why put your missiles there? Cuba, probably a much harder one to solve for us,
Right.
just politically, diplomatically, I would imagine.
Right. Yeah. So you're looking at another potential, October crisis.
Yeah. Good
The
point.
Russians have got their full court deterrence operation going on right now. They absolutely do not want the Ukrainians to have the Tomahawks because they know how painful it will be for them. And they're using all the levers they can to try and threaten, cajole, scare, and then leave open. I think it was either Peskov or Ryabkov, the deputy foreign minister, who came out and said that the peace talks have stalled. Well, they've come almost to a complete standstill because of this. No, it's because President Putin didn't take the opportunity that was given to him in Alaska to stop this insanity. And the Russians are trying every mechanism they have to threaten, scare the Europeans, scare Washington. My own view is that we should call their bluff. If they want to try and put weapon systems in Cuba or Venezuela, and by the way, Cuba isn't off the table either for the United States. It's the Western Hemisphere. I think you're seeing a buildup of U.S. troops in the Western Hemisphere, U.S. power. And I was at a dinner last night where I'm not going to name a name, but someone very senior in the government, the administration, said we've ignored the Western Hemisphere for far too long, and this administration is really paying attention to what's going on there. So, and there are people in the administration, senior, who are very smart and who understand the issue of Cuba very well, and have no desire to see the Cuban regime succeed in blackmailing the United States. So I'm sure if they try to put Sarmat or Iskander missiles in Cuba or Venezuela, there will be a swift response from the White House. I'm very confident.
There's a lot of talk, Glenn, of Cubans not being so nice to our diplomats overseas. Obviously, with the can't remember what it's called, the channeling of audio signatures that we've attributed to them. But just in general, did you end up running up against any of these Cubans that treated you poorly on the dip circuit in your time?
No, I was never mistreated poorly by a Cuban. Honestly, I had very little interaction in the places I was with Cubans. There are a lot of legends or urban legends, stories about things that happened to American officials in Cuba. And of course, you're mentioning the Havana syndrome, also known as, what is it called? There's an official term for it, very serious issue. And I'm not going to get into it here, but there's a lot going on still now. I read recently that there's more activity in Congress and more information coming out on kind of what was really going on. Something maybe we should talk about in a future episode. I want to do a little bit more research to get up to date.
Health incidents?
Anonymous health incidents. Yeah. And unfortunately, we had some people that were really impacted. Heartbreaking to see the medical issues that they went through. And no one to this day is sure on who was behind it, but it all started in Cuba, in Havana.
All right, that is a good topic for another day as well. That would be a very interesting one to dig into. Last bit on Russia, I will say, you alluded to it earlier. Zelensky has mentioned that I think they disrupted 20% of Russia's, let me get this right, 20% of Russia's fuel production, in large part thanks to some of these deeper drone or missile strikes that Ukraine is taking in Russia. One take I wanted to get from you, they said that they struck a fuel plant over the past 48 hours in Tyumen in Siberia, which sound Tumen.
Tumen, yeah. That's deep inside of Russia.
That's deep, right? I mean, this is a signal they can reach almost anything in that matters in Russia.
That is deep inside of Russia.
Jeez.
Yeah. And it just talks about speaks to the innovation and the resilience of the Ukrainians. Unfortunately, the Russians also unleashed hell on Ukraine, including Kiev last night. I think the largest scale attack in a while, directed against civilian targets and the energy infrastructure, which is the pattern of the Russians as we go into cold weather season. Every year in this war, they've tried to destroy the Ukrainian power grid, to freeze. I've said this before, they're trying to freeze the Ukrainians into submission.
That's absolutely right. And I should have said at the outset, all of our opinions are our own, because I just want to talk on this for a second. Having looked at cyber threats for so long, in different places, this is absolutely their playbook targeting Ukraine, and has been for 10 plus years as they've moved against Ukraine, trying to knock their grid offline and freeze them out in the wintertime. They test a lot of their malware there first before it goes more globally. And now it's got a very real effect on people as cold as it gets there. I mean, this is no surprise they can now take physical strikes at that energy grid.
Yeah, and they've been doing that. I mean, definitely since 2023, 2022. But what's interesting, you said 10 years. I would suggest that even before Crimea, they were doing this. I mean, and I've been saying this in some of the public talks I do. Even if there's a ceasefire tomorrow, the Russian cyber attacks, the sabotage, the disinformation operations, the political action against the Ukrainian government, stability inside of Ukraine will almost surely continue if the current regime in Moscow stays in place. And we have to be very cognizant of that. And in my opinion, we have to continue to help the Ukrainians to protect themselves from that. The only difference is after 2014, Ukrainians have, as we were just mentioning, they've demonstrated an ability to strike back, which is also painful for Moscow. So I hope that people in the Kremlin realize that they're not, like in the past, they could do this almost without consequence. That's no longer the case.
True. And yeah, going back, 2014 was black energy, 2015 to 18, gray energy. These are targeting the grids. Sandworm, which a lot of people have seen, and great books about investigations into those groups. Very sophisticated, but this is really the Russian MO for sure.
Right.
Freeze them out. You're right.
And we should study this in the United States. Like any future conflict will include that against, and by it's already happening, I think, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
not just by the Russians, but other hostile actors are targeting us very aggressively in the cyberspace.
Yep. And then, Glenn, I thought we touched just briefly on China, a few things, because the Trump Xi meeting is coming up. So we probably need to do a deeper dive on China and what this means. But you've got a whole host of economic measures going back and forth. We talked about one of them, the high precision machine tools that they are quietly cutting off to Russia. But also, and I think this is the kicker, I mean, it produces or exports 90% of rare earth materials that are required. And now they're saying any product with even a 0.1% Chinese origin rare earth requires approval for export. And certainly military applications are not on the table for that.
Right.
That is a big deal for civilian infrastructure, but also weapons and AI. That is a big one that they have as a serious bargaining chip going forward.
Absolutely. I think there are a couple of questions here. One, is it enforceable? How do you enforce that? Two, what is that going to do to their relationships with some of their other partners or business relationships? Just like when we put sanctions on a country, it impacts our alliances, our relationships with other countries. So I'm sure Beijing has got to, if I were looking at this, I'd say, okay, like, is it realistic? It definitely seems to be a bargaining tactic that they're using going into negotiations. So kind of a hardline position. They think they have us by the short hair. And three, it should be a wake up call for Americans and our allies. We need to find alternatives and invest in developing and processing those alternatives. So we should never have allowed ourselves to get so over reliant on one source. We just talked about Turkey becoming over reliant on Russia for oil and gas. Well, we did the same thing, right? Rare earth minerals.
Absolutely. There are two things I want to get your take on here, separate from rare earth minerals, which is something that we are proposing to go back at China with that really baffled me. We're going to potentially ban Chinese airliners carrying people, not cargo, but people, from using Russian airspace, prevent them from landing in the US coming from China if they overfly Russian airspace.
Right.
Which, we can enforce that because we can see where they came from. What I didn't realize is we haven't been allowed to use Russian airspace, which makes sense since the war started. So higher prices, forcing us other directions. And now we're saying we're going to put that on China. And they reacted immediately. They are not happy about this.
Right.
As
right.
Very surprising.
Yeah. I mean, it would probably impose a cost on the Chinese, impact, obviously, air flights. It would be disastrous. Like anyone that's flying in that region now knows they're flying way out of their way, spending extra long time, a lot more fuel, resources, hours in the air to get places because of this war. And I'm sure the Chinese are not happy with it. I think the U.S. position is it's unfair for U.S. airliners as, non-competitive. And I'm sure the Chinese are saying, which their actions have demonstrated for years, they don't really care about fair competition. They're not about that.
Then on the espionage front, this was really sad to hear. I guess a pretty significant spy case in the UK that they had formulated for some time. Two Brits who had been working for Beijing effectively passing information. The case collapsed in court because the UK government refused to describe China as an enemy under a century-old law. And I cannot understand that positioning from an espionage standpoint. Does that not just open the door for so many more problems to openly let your case collapse?
Well, I don't want to comment. I'm not really deep on this case, and I don't want to comment. I'm always very sensitive or careful to accuse somebody of being guilty of a crime that, like, unless there's any strong evidence. I don't know what the evidence is in this case. What I do know is that I think this will be interpreted by many in the US as being a kind of a double standard. The British want us to do certain things, but then they're not willing to do the same things because they don't want to violate their laws or they don't want to cross the Chinese. Some people are interpreting this as the British government not wanting to upset Beijing too much,
Interesting.
right? So I think for me, like geopolitically, that's a concern.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are a lot of investigators and a lot of people that worked on this case who are very, very upset right now in the United Kingdom. My sympathy to those people who have been working really hard, I'm sure, to build a good case. And now to have it thrown out on some technicality and then to have the perception that there may be some political angle here or some diplomatic angle is absolutely frustrating. I think we've all been through that.
Ugh.
So I'm sorry to our UK colleagues.
And then the last thing that caught my attention, very small footnote over the past week, satellite imagery and open source reporting shows that a Chinese base in deep, like Inner Mongolia, I guess, has expanded in size. Its mock compound slash building architecture of Taipei's basic central residence, effectively like their White House, parliament type environment,
Right.
where they practice drills. And you could think of this as decapitation practice if they were to go into Taiwan and need to move quickly into leadership buildings and rooms. They have a mock version of this that they've expanded in size, which you probably do because you want more familiarity with it, as
Right.
we may do
Right.
back in the day. I found this to be very interesting, not surprising necessarily, but wow, escalation.
So just a couple of comments there. One, what other mock-ups do they have? Right. By the way, if anyone knows they have a mock-up of my house, let me know, please. I'd appreciate that. If the Chinese are listening, I have a very big dog.
You got a big dog. Get ready.
Not really that aggressive, but she's a good dog. But seriously, I mean, for Taiwanese, they're obviously under immense pressure. The Chinese are doing all kinds of things to put pressure, intimidate, psychological warfare, disinformation, I would say acts of sabotage, the same things we're seeing the Russians do in Europe, the PRC is doing to the government of Taiwan, the people of Taiwan right now. And so this news, I'm sure the Chinese probably want this information out there. It's just another psychological tool used to intimidate the people of Taiwan and the people that work in that compound. So,
Glenn, what else? What did we miss, Chief? Anything?
no, I mean there's so much going on. We kind of touched on, Venezuela, the Western Hemisphere. There's always, I mean, there's just a lot going on this week. Some very positive things, of course, and we're always things that could potentially go wrong. So it's a very mixed world as usual and very complicated world. But that's why we do this podcast. I want to say, I ran into some people. I was at a dinner last night, a large event, and a couple of people mentioned the podcast and how much they appreciated it. And they just told us to keep going. We will keep going. And we're always looking for people that follow us or kind of, pay attention to what we're doing to give us ideas on subjects they want to hear us talk about. If we can talk about it, we'll do it.
Yeah. And maybe it's worth noting for people. Obviously, you can find it in the description, but you can reach out info@restrictedhandling.com. But a few things we're trying to tee up are going deep analysis on some of the drone warfare, what that looks like in Ukraine and Russia, obviously. Some gray area operations that we find fascinating ourselves, and I think a lot of people will. Cognitive warfare, which I think you put me onto, and going deeper on sanctions and some of the impacts there and what's happening. And we need to not snooze on that because it's economic.
Right.
That is a massive lever in this world.
Hey, Ryan, I'm glad you mentioned that. Also, like, we're going to look for someone to talk on Taiwan, obviously PRC. You mentioned the summit coming up, very big, important event. The last thing I'll say, you talk about the economics, the keynote speaker at this event where I was at last night talked about how important commercial diplomacy is for the Trump administration. And it was almost a breath of fresh air because this is something I think we've ignored for a long time. And there is a real push to, get the U.S. government behind U.S. business and U.S. business behind U.S. national security interests to project our positive influence around the world and help settle or, I mentioned a lot of these successes we've had require sustainment. And I think that this administration, this is just my interpretation, but they believe sustainment's going to come from U.S. investment and U.S. business, not just from the State Department or from DOD. We can't blow our way or fight our way, blow up our way out of every conflict. And so I was really interested. It's very interesting to hear that that's the trend I've seen, and goes back to the economic piece. Maybe we can find someone to come on and talk about, like, what is commercial diplomacy?
Yeah, that's a good one.
It's been practiced by the U.S. before very effectively. And so I'm glad to see that we're trying it again. All
Glenn,
right.
you have a great weekend. Thanks for
You
spending this
too.
time with us again.
What are you doing in California this weekend?
Big weekend. Going to visit my oldest in college for one night. Then I'm coming back for another kid's birthday. 2 homecomings this weekend.
Amazing.
Yeah.
You guys have a great time. I'm going to see Dave Chappelle tonight with my youngest son.
No, you're not.
Yes,
Where?
we are.
What's
Here in
the
DC. In
Okay.
DC. I remember one of the arenas. So we're pretty excited. The Chappelle Show.
Oh,
Yeah. Anyway,
all
so
right.
all right. You be good. Thanks again, Ryan. And yeah, we'll come up with a lot more interesting topics.